At 30,000 feet above enemy territory, Captain Sidney Grant's hands barely reached the controls of the massive B-52 Stratofortress. The bomber had been built for men twice her size, its cockpit designed decades ago when no one imagined a woman would command such devastating firepower. Today, that assumption would be tested against impossible odds. When radar screens lit up with incoming enemy fighters led by the legendary ace known as the Phantom, Sidney realized her greatest challenge wasn't the aircraft's size, it was surviving the next hour. Before we dive into Sidney's incredible story, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I love connecting with our viewers all around the world. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Captain Sidney Grant pushed through the heavy doors of Briefing Room C. Her boots clicked against the polished floor, each step echoing in the windowless space. 20 plastic chairs faced a projection screen, but only 3 were occupied. Colonel Martinez looked up from his paperwork. "Grant, take a seat." Sidney pulled out a chair in the front row. The metal legs scraped against the floor. She straightened her uniform jacket and waited. "Gentlemen," Martinez began, then caught himself. "Officers, we have a situation." The lights dimmed. A satellite image filled the screen, rugged mountains cut by deep valleys, gray and brown terrain stretching to the horizon. "Enemy territory," Martinez continued. "Intelligence suggests they're moving advanced weapons through this region. We need eyes on the ground, but it's too dangerous for troops. That leaves us with one option." The image changed. A massive aircraft appeared on screen, 8 engines, swept wings, a fortress of steel and aluminum. The B-52 Stratofortress. Major Phillips whistled low. "That's a big bird for a recon mission." "It's the only aircraft with the range and defensive systems to survive the trip," Martinez said. He clicked to the next slide. "The mission requires precision flying through mountain passes. Low altitude. Radio silence. One pilot." Sidney felt her pulse quicken. She'd trained on simulators, studied every manual, but she'd never actually flown a B-52. "Grant," Martinez said, turning to face her. "You're our pilot." The room went quiet. Phillips shifted in his chair. Captain Reynolds cleared his throat. "Sir," Phillips said slowly, with respect, "the B-52 it's a demanding aircraft. The controls require significant physical strength." Martinez nodded. "I'm aware of your concerns, Major. But Captain Grant scored highest on the navigation tests. She knows those mountains better than anyone." Sidney kept her expression neutral, but her hands clenched in her lap. She'd heard this conversation before, different rooms, different missions, same doubts. "The Stratofortress cockpit was designed in the 50s, Reynolds added. "For pilots who were, well, larger." "Are you questioning my judgment, Captain?" Martinez asked. "No, sir. Just stating facts." Sidney stood up. "May I see the aircraft, Colonel?" "Of course." "Follow me." They walked through empty corridors, their footsteps echoing off bare walls. Through a side door, then another. Finally, Martinez pushed open a set of massive doors. The hangar stretched 3 stories high. In the center sat the B-52, its silver skin gleaming under the harsh lights. Sidney had seen pictures, watched videos, but nothing prepared her for the actual size. The bomber seemed to fill the entire space. "Impressive, isn't she?" Martinez said. Sidney walked closer. The landing gear alone stood taller than her head. She had to crane her neck to see the cockpit windows, tiny black squares 40 feet above the concrete floor. "How do I get up there?" she asked. "Ladders on the side," Martinez pointed. "But first, let me show you something." He led her to a maintenance stand positioned near the aircraft's nose. They climbed the metal steps until they reached cockpit level. Martinez opened the hatch. "After you," he said. Sidney squeezed through the opening. Inside, instrument panels covered every surface. Switches, dials, and levers crowded the cramped space. The pilot's seat sat in the center, surrounded by controls that seemed miles away. She settled into the seat and reached for the throttles. Her fingertips barely touched the controls. She tried the rudder pedals. Her feet couldn't apply full pressure while maintaining a grip on the control yoke. The original designers assumed all pilots would be at least 6 feet tall, Martinez said from behind her. Most were closer to 6'2". Sydney stretched her arms, testing her reach to various switches. Some required her to lean forward and strain. Others she couldn't touch without releasing the controls entirely. "This is going to be interesting," she said. "Can you handle it?" Sydney ran her hands along the control yoke, feeling the worn grip tape left by countless pilots before her. She thought about the mission, the mountains, the enemy territory waiting beyond the horizon. "I'll make it work," she said. Martinez smiled. "That's what I wanted to hear. Mission briefing is tomorrow at 0600. Get some rest, Captain. You've got 3 weeks to master this beast." As they climbed down from the cockpit, Sydney took one last look at the massive bomber. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. The alarm clock screamed at 4:30. Sydney rolled out of bed, her muscles already protesting from yesterday's training session. 3 weeks to master a bomber designed for pilots twice her size. She pulled on her flight suit and headed for the hangar. The B-52 waited in the same spot, massive and intimidating under the early morning lights. Maintenance crews swarmed around it like ants, checking systems, refueling, preparing for another day of training flights. "You're early," called Sergeant Williams from beneath the aircraft. He slid out on a wheeled cart, grease streaking his coveralls. "Most pilots don't show up until the coffee's ready." "Couldn't sleep," Sydney said. "Mind if I take another look inside?" "All yours. Just don't touch anything we haven't cleared yet." Sydney climbed the ladder and squeezed through the hatch. In the cockpit, she settled into the pilot's seat and began her morning ritual, testing her reach to every control. Yesterday, she'd struggled to operate the engine start switches. Today, she'd brought a cushion. She positioned the cushion behind her back and tried again. Better. Her fingers could now reach the overhead panel without straining. She made a mental note to request official seat modifications. "Working on your stretching exercises?" Sydney turned. Major Phillips stood in the hatch opening, coffee cup in hand. "Seat adjustments," she said. "The original configuration doesn't quite fit." Phillips climbed inside and took the co-pilot seat. "Mind if I ask you something?" "Shoot. Why do you want this mission?" "I mean, really want it. This isn't exactly a career-boosting assignment." Sydney continued testing switches while she talked. "Because someone has to do it. And I'm qualified." "Qualified, sure. But there are other qualified pilots." "Are there?" Sydney turned to face him. "How many pilots do you know who can navigate those mountain passes in radio silence? How many have studied those valleys for 6 months straight?" Phillips sipped his coffee. "Fair point. Besides," Sydney continued, reaching for the radio controls, "maybe it's time this aircraft had a pilot who actually fits the mission instead of the other way around." Over the next hour, Phillips walked her through emergency procedures. Engine failures, hydraulic problems, electrical fires. Each scenario required quick access to specific controls. Sydney practiced until her movements became automatic. "Not bad," Phillips said as they finished. "Your reaction time is actually faster than most pilots I've trained." "Smaller movements," Sydney explained. "Less distance to travel." Captain Reynolds appeared in the hatch. "Ready for some actual flying?" The pre-flight inspection took 2 hours. Sydney and Reynolds walked around the entire aircraft, checking every surface, every component. The B-52 stretched longer than a football field. Its wingtips seemed to reach forever. "Engine start sequence is tricky," Reynolds said as they climbed back inside. 8 engines, specific order. Mess it up and you could damage the whole aircraft. Sydney strapped herself in and ran through the checklist. One by one, the massive engines roared to life. The bomber shook like a living thing, power vibrating through every rivet and bolt. "Tower, this is Big Bird requesting taxi clearance," Sydney spoke into her headset. "Big Bird, cleared to taxi runway 27. Wind 090 at 15 knots. The control tower was 3 miles away, but Sydney could see it clearly through the cockpit windows. The B-52 sat so high off the ground that everything below looked miniature. Taxiing proved challenging. The bomber's wingspan required careful attention to ground obstacles. Sydney had to rely on ground crew signals to navigate safely between hangars and parked aircraft. "Take your time," Reynolds said. "She handles like a freight train on ice." At the runway threshold, Sydney ran through final checks. Flight controls, engine parameters, navigation systems. Everything showed green. Tower, Big Bird ready for departure. Big Bird, cleared for takeoff. Sydney pushed the throttles forward. 8 engines thundered in response. The bomber began rolling, slowly at first, then building speed. At 150 knots, she pulled back on the control yoke. The B-52 lifted off like a loaded elevator, climbing steadily but without urgency. Sydney felt the aircraft settle into its element, the sky. How does she feel? Reynolds asked. Heavy. Solid. Like flying a building. They spent 3 hours practicing basic maneuvers. Turns, climbs, descents. Sydney learned to anticipate the bomber's slow responses. Every input required patience. The B-52 didn't change direction so much as gradually adjust its path through the sky. Landing proved even more challenging than takeoff. The bomber approached the runway like a falling mountain, requiring precise speed and angle control. Sydney's first attempt came in too high. She executed a go-around and tried again. The second approach felt better. She kept the engines spooled up, ready for another go-around if needed. But the B-52 settled onto the runway with surprising grace, its massive landing gear absorbing the impact. Not bad for a first-timer, Reynolds said as they taxied back to the hangar. That afternoon, Sydney met with Colonel Martinez in his office. Maps covered every wall, topographical charts of enemy territory, satellite photos of mountain ranges, weather patterns stretching back 5 years. Intelligence has confirmed enemy activity in this sector. Martinez pointed to a valley system marked in red. Anti-aircraft batteries here, here, and here. Fighter patrols operating from this airfield. Sydney studied the terrain. What about this route? She traced a path through lower valleys, avoiding the marked threat areas. Longer flight time. More fuel consumption. But better survival odds. Martinez nodded. That's why you're flying this mission. Other pilots see obstacles. You see opportunities. He handed her a thick folder. Threat assessments, enemy pilot profiles, known tactics. Pay special attention to this one. Sydney opened the folder to a photograph of a man in enemy uniform. Sharp eyes, confident smile, rows of medals across his chest. Alexei the Phantom Volkov, Martinez continued. 43 confirmed kills. Specializes in hunting lone aircraft. His squadron operates in your target area. How good is he? Good enough that we've lost 6 aircraft trying to find out. Sydney closed the folder and stood up. When do we launch? 1 week. That gives you 6 more days to master that bomber. She headed for the door, then paused. Colonel, what happens if I encounter the Phantom? Martinez looked up from his desk. Pray he's having an off day. That evening, Sydney returned to the hangar for one final look at her aircraft. The maintenance crews had finished their work. The B-52 sat silent and ready, a sleeping giant waiting for tomorrow's training session. She climbed the ladder one more time and settled into the pilot's seat. In 6 days, she'd be flying this machine into enemy territory, alone, against the most dangerous pilot in their air force. The mission parameters were clear. The risks were understood. All that remained was preparation. The mission clock read 0400 hours when Sydney arrived at the flight line. Stars still dotted the sky, but the eastern horizon showed the faintest hint of dawn. Ground crews moved with quiet efficiency around the B-52, completing final preparations under dim red lights that wouldn't compromise night vision. Morning, Captain, Sergeant Williams called softly. She's fueled and ready. All systems check green. Sydney nodded and began her walk-around inspection. The bomber looked different in the pre-dawn darkness, larger, more menacing. Her flashlight beams swept across control surfaces, engine intakes, landing gear. Everything appeared normal, but today normal wasn't enough. Long flight ahead, Williams said, following her around the aircraft. Weather looks good for the first half. Some clouds building over the mountains, but nothing you can't handle. Thanks, Sergeant. Take care of things while I'm gone. You just bring our bird home safe. In the briefing room, Colonel Martinez waited with final intelligence updates. Red pins marked enemy positions on the large wall map. New ones had appeared overnight. Latest satellite imagery shows increased activity here. Martinez pointed to a valley junction. Could be routine patrol changes, could be something more. We're still a go, but stay alert. Sydney studied the updated threat positions. What about communication windows? Radio silence until you reach the extraction point. If you run into trouble before then, you're on your own. The weight of those words settled in the room. No backup, no rescue, no support. Just Sydney, her aircraft, and whatever waited beyond the mountains. Any questions? Martinez asked. No, sir. Ready to launch. At the aircraft, Sydney climbed through the hatch and settled into her modified pilot's seat. The cushions and adjustments she'd requested had been installed. For the first time, every control fell within comfortable reach. She strapped in and began the engine start sequence. One by one, the 8 turbojets spooled to life, their whine building to a steady roar. The bomber trembled with contained power. Tower, Big Bird requesting taxi clearance. Big Bird, cleared to taxi runway 09. Wind calm, visibility unrestricted. The taxi to the runway took 15 minutes. Other aircraft moved aside as the massive bomber rolled past. Sydney saw ground crews pausing their work to watch. Word had spread that this wasn't a training flight. At the runway threshold, she ran through final checks. Navigation systems aligned, fuel quantity confirmed, defensive systems armed but not active. Everything showed ready. Tower, Big Bird holding short, ready for departure. Big Bird, you're cleared for takeoff. Winds 060 at 8 knots. Sydney pushed the throttles forward. The B-52 began its roll, gathering speed slowly but steadily. At rotation speed, she pulled back on the yoke. The bomber lifted off into the gray dawn sky. Climbing through 10,000 feet, Sydney switched to her programmed navigation route. The autopilot engaged with a soft click. From here to the target area, the bomber would fly itself, following waypoints programmed weeks earlier. The sun rose behind her as she crossed friendly territory. Below, farmland and small towns stretched to the horizon. Normal people starting normal days, unaware that a lone bomber flew overhead carrying cameras that might prevent a war or start one. At 30,000 feet, the B-52 settled into cruise flight. Sydney monitored engine parameters and navigation displays. Everything ran smoothly. Almost boring except for what lay ahead. 2 hours into the flight, she crossed the first checkpoint. Mountain peaks rose ahead, their snow-covered summits gleaming in the morning light. Beyond those mountains lay enemy territory. Sydney switched off the autopilot and took manual control. From now on, she'd hand-fly the bomber through valleys and passes, staying below radar coverage, avoiding detection until the last possible moment. The first mountain pass required precise navigation. Sydney descended to 15,000 feet, then lower. The bomber flew between peaks that rose on both sides, their rocky walls uncomfortably close. Steady, she said aloud, her voice the only sound in the cockpit. Nice and easy. The pass opened into a broader valley. Sydney checked her position against the chart clipped to her knee. On course, on time. She began the descent toward the next waypoint, a narrow canyon that would take her deeper into hostile airspace. At 12,000 feet, the terrain closed in again. Canyon walls rose on both sides, forcing Sydney to fly a precise path down the center. One mistake, one moment of inattention, and the bomber would become a fireball against solid rock. The radar warning receiver remained silent. No enemy radars had detected her yet. The low-altitude approach was working. 30 minutes later, she emerged from the canyon system into enemy territory proper. The landscape looked identical to the friendly side, same mountains, same valleys, same morning shadows. But here, missiles and fighter aircraft waited for unwary intruders. Sydney armed the defensive systems and activated the radar warning equipment. The cockpit filled with new displays, threat indicators that would tell her if enemy radars found the bomber. She descended to 8,000 feet, hugging the valley floor. The B-52 was never designed for this kind of flying, terrain following at low altitude, dodging between mountain peaks. But today it had no choice. The target area lay 40 minutes ahead. Sydney began the approach to her first photo run, a straight line over suspected weapon sites. No evasive maneuvers, no deviations. Just steady flight while cameras recorded everything below. That's when the radar warning receiver lit up. Multiple radar signals, strong and close. Surface-to-air missile sites, exactly where intelligence said they wouldn't be. Sydney's heart rate jumped, but her hands remained steady on the controls. The signals grew stronger. Somewhere below, enemy operators watched their screens, trying to identify the aircraft flying through their airspace. Sydney reduced power and descended further, hoping the mountains would block their radar beams. More warning tones filled the cockpit. Air search radars now, the kind used to guide interceptor aircraft. Sydney checked her defensive systems, chaff dispensers loaded, electronic jammers ready, tail guns armed and operational. Still no visual contact with enemy fighters, but the radar warnings told the story. They knew she was here. They were looking for her. Soon they would find her. Sydney reached the first photo target and began her camera run. The bomber flew straight and level while automated systems recorded everything below. Weapons storage bunkers, vehicle parks, communication towers, all preserved on film for intelligence analysis. The photo run lasted 3 minutes. 3 minutes of straight flight with no evasive action, no defensive maneuvering. 3 minutes of making herself a perfect target for anyone who might be watching. As she completed the run and turned toward the next target, new radar signals appeared on her threat display. Fighter radars, airborne and searching. Multiple contacts, closing from the north. Sydney pushed the throttles forward and began climbing. The second photo target would have to wait. Right now, survival mattered more than reconnaissance. The radar warning receiver erupted in multiple tones. Missile guidance radars, fighter intercept radars, ground control stations, all focused on her position. The secret mission had become very public very quickly. Through her headset, Sydney heard something that chilled her blood. Radio chatter in the enemy language, but with one word she recognized clearly. Phantom. Alexei Volkov was airborne and hunting. The most dangerous pilot in enemy service was coming for her, and she was alone in a bomber designed for level flight, not aerial combat. Sydney banked hard left and dove toward a narrow valley, hoping to break the radar locks before missiles started flying. The B-52 groaned under the G-forces, protesting the violent maneuver. Behind her, multiple enemy fighters converged on her last known position. Ahead lay more mountains, more valleys, and the slim hope that she could disappear before the Phantom found his next victim. The mission had just become a fight for survival, and Sydney Grant was about to learn whether 3 weeks of training would be enough to keep her alive against the most feared pilot in enemy service. Sydney dove the B-52 toward the valley floor, watching her altimeter unwind rapidly. 6,000 feet, 5,000, 4,000. The rocky walls blurred past her wingtips as she pulled out of the dive and leveled off barely 1,000 feet above the canyon bottom. The radar warning receiver screamed multiple alerts. Enemy fighters were closing fast from 3 directions. Sydney switched her radio to emergency frequency and keyed the microphone. Any friendly aircraft, this is Big Bird declaring emergency. Under attack by multiple bandits, coordinates. Big Bird, this is Eagle Leader. We copy your distress call. For F-16s inbound to your position. Sydney felt a surge of relief. She wasn't alone after all. A fighter escort had been positioned nearby, probably without her knowledge. Eagle Leader, be advised I'm flying low level in the valley system. Multiple enemy radars active. Roger, Big Bird. We have you on scope. Bandits approaching from your northeast. Estimate 6 to 8 aircraft. Through the cockpit canopy, Sydney spotted movement against the morning sky. Dark specks diving from high altitude, growing larger by the second. Enemy fighters, at least 6 of them, descending like hawks toward their prey. Eagle Leader, I have visual on the bandits. They're coming in fast. Copy that. Eagle Flight, engage the fighters. Big Bird, maintain current heading and stay low. The first missiles streaked across the sky, white contrails marking their paths. Sydney watched 4 F-16s climb to meet the enemy formation. Within seconds, the peaceful mountain valley became a battlefield. Eagle 2, bandit on your 6. I see him. Breaking left. Radio chatter filled Sydney's headset as the fighter pilots engaged in aerial combat high above her position. She kept the B-52 low, following the valley floor while the battle raged overhead. An explosion lit the sky to her right. Someone had taken a hit, but she couldn't tell whose aircraft had been destroyed. The radio went silent for a moment, then crackled back to life. Eagle Leader to Big Bird. We're taking heavy casualties up here. These guys are good. Really good. How many are left? At least 4 bandits still active. One of them is flying like nothing I've ever seen. Might be that ace they warned us about. The Phantom. Sydney had hoped to avoid him entirely, but apparently he'd found the battle anyway. Another explosion, closer this time. Through her side window, Sydney saw burning wreckage falling toward the mountainside. The fighter's wings tumbled separately from the fuselage, trailing smoke and flame. Eagle 3 is down. Eagle 3 is down. Eagle 4, where are you? Taking fire from 2 bandits. Can't shake them. Sydney climbed slightly to clear a ridgeline and spotted the dogfight above. 2 F-16s twisted and turned against 4 enemy aircraft. The Americans were outnumbered and clearly outmatched. Big Bird, you need to get out of here, Eagle Leader transmitted. We can't hold them much longer. What about you guys? Just go. That's an order. A missile detonation lit the valley walls orange. When the smoke cleared, only 1 F-16 remained airborne. 3 enemy fighters circled above it like wolves around wounded prey. Eagle Leader, talk to me. Still here, Big Bird. But not for long. I'm hit and losing fuel fast. Sydney watched the lone F-16 struggling to maintain altitude. Smoke streamed from its engine, and its flight path showed the erratic movements of a badly damaged aircraft. Can you make it to friendly territory? Negative. I'm going down in about 2 minutes. Get out of here while you still can. The enemy fighters had broken off their attack on the F-16 and were turning towards Sydney's position. They'd eliminated the escort and now focused their attention on the primary target. Big Bird, listen carefully. Eagle Leader's voice was strained but steady. The lead bandit is flying a dark gray fighter with red markings. That's got to be the Phantom. He's been hanging back, letting the others do the fighting. Now he's coming for you personally. Sydney scanned the sky and found the aircraft Eagle Leader described. A sleek fighter jet, darker than the others, flying with casual precision while the remaining enemy aircraft formed up behind it. How do I fight him? You don't. You run. Find the thickest terrain you can and hope he makes a mistake. The radio went silent. Sydney looked up to see Eagle Leader's F-16 disappearing behind a mountain peak, still trailing smoke. He was either trying to find a place to eject or attempting to crash land somewhere beyond the ridgeline. Now she was truly alone. The enemy formation split up, with 3 fighters spreading out to cut off her escape routes. The dark gray fighter, the Phantom's aircraft, came straight toward her position with deliberate, unhurried precision. Sydney pushed her throttles to maximum power and turned toward the narrowest canyon she could find. The B-52's engines roared in response, but the massive bomber accelerated slowly. Fighter jets could outrun her easily in level flight. Her only advantage was terrain. The bomber could fly lower than most fighters dared, threading through valleys and canyons where high-speed aircraft couldn't safely maneuver. She dove into a narrow gorge, canyon walls rising steeply on both sides. The passage was barely wide enough for the B-52's wingspan. Any fighter following her would have to slow down dramatically or risk flying into solid rock. Behind her, she heard the distinctive whine of jet engines at high speed. The enemy aircraft were closing the gap quickly. Sydney checked her defensive systems, chaff dispensers ready, electronic jammers active, tail gunner position armed. The B-52 had a tail gun, a remotely operated cannon designed to defend against attacking fighters. Sydney had practiced with it during training, but using it in actual combat was another matter entirely. Come on, she whispered, banking hard left to follow the canyon's twist. Stay with me, big girl. The bomber's structure groaned under the stress of low-altitude maneuvering. These aircraft were built for high-altitude bombing runs, not canyon racing at maximum speed. A missile streaked past her left wing, close enough that she could see its fins and guidance system. The explosion against the canyon wall showered the bomber with rock fragments, spider-webbing her port side windows. Sydney activated the tail gun system and turned control over to the automatic tracking radar. The gun turret swiveled toward the nearest target and opened fire, sending streams of 20mm shells toward the pursuing fighters. One enemy aircraft pulled up sharply to avoid the defensive fire. Another broke right and climbed out of the canyon. But the dark gray fighter continued its pursuit, closing steadily despite the bomber's defensive fire. Sydney's engines began showing warning lights. Maximum power in thin mountain air was overheating the turbojets. She had maybe 10 minutes before engine failures would force her to reduce speed. The canyon began to widen ahead. In 30 seconds, she'd lose the protection of the narrow walls and become an easy target for the fighters circling above. She had to make a choice. Continue running and hope to find another canyon, or turn and fight with whatever advantages her massive bomber could provide. The radar warning receiver lit up with new signals. More enemy aircraft approaching from the east. Reinforcements were arriving, and Sydney's fuel was running low from high-power flight at low altitude. "All right, Phantom," she said aloud, her hands steady on the controls despite everything happening around her. "Let's see what you've got." Sydney pulled the B-52 into a climbing turn, heading directly toward the fighter formation instead of away from it. The massive bomber's unexpected maneuver caught the enemy pilots off guard. For a moment, they seemed uncertain how to respond. That moment of hesitation was exactly what Sydney had hoped for. But as she climbed toward the waiting fighters, she realized she was about to learn whether 3 weeks of training could overcome decades of fighter pilot experience. The real battle was just beginning, and Sydney Grant was running out of places to hide. Sydney climbed straight toward the enemy formation, her massive bomber rising like an angry mountain against the morning sky. The enemy fighters scattered in confusion. No bomber pilot had ever turned toward them before. What is she doing? The radio crackled with enemy voices speaking in their own language, but the tone was universal. Surprise. Sydney leveled off at 12,000 feet and rolled the B-52 inverted. The world flipped upside down as she dove back toward the canyon system, using the bomber's massive bulk to scatter the enemy formation. "That was either brilliant or suicidal," she muttered, rolling back to level flight as she dropped into another valley. Behind her, the enemy fighters regrouped quickly. The dark gray aircraft, the Phantom's fighter, led the formation with deadly precision. 3 others followed in perfect formation, their pilots clearly experienced. Sydney's radar warning receiver showed multiple lock-on signals. The fighters were preparing to launch missiles from beyond visual range. She had maybe 30 seconds before the air filled with guided death. She banked hard right into a side canyon, using the terrain to break the radar locks. The missile warning tone stopped, but she knew it was temporary. The moment she emerged from the canyon, the fighters would re-establish their targeting. "Think, Sydney," she said aloud. "What can a bomber do that fighters can't?" The answer came to her as she rounded a bend in the valley. Ahead lay a series of rock formations, tall spires, and narrow gaps between towering stone pillars. A fighter pilot would never risk threading through such obstacles at high speed. But a bomber pilot might. Sydney descended until she was flying barely 50 feet above the canyon floor. The B-52's massive wingspan cleared the rock spires by mere inches on each side. Behind her, she heard the distinctive whine of fighter engines being throttled back. The enemy pilots were good, but they weren't crazy. "Come on," she whispered, weaving between the stone towers. "Follow me if you can." One fighter tried to match her path. Sydney heard the engine noise growing louder, then suddenly cutting back as the pilot realized the gap was too narrow for his aircraft's wingspan. But the Phantom was patient. His radio voice cut through the chatter, calm and measured. Sydney couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear. He was giving orders, positioning his aircraft for a better attack angle. The rock spires ended abruptly. Sydney emerged into open sky with nowhere to hide. 3 fighters waited above her, positioned to attack from different angles. The fourth, the Phantom's dark gray aircraft, hung back and watched. He's studying me, Sydney realized. Learning how I fly. A missile streaked down from her left. Sydney rolled the bomber hard right, using its surprising agility to avoid the incoming weapon. The missile impacted harmlessly against a mountainside, sending up a plume of smoke and debris. 2 more missiles followed. Sydney dove toward the valley floor, then pulled up sharply as the weapons overshot their target. The B-52 structure groaned under the violent maneuvers, but held together. "This girl's tougher than she looks," Sydney said, patting the instrument panel. But her engines were overheating from sustained maximum power. Yellow warning lights glowed across the panel. She had to reduce throttles or risk complete engine failure. The moment she decreased power, the fighters closed in. Sydney activated her tail gun system and opened fire at the nearest pursuer. 20mm shells traced bright lines through the morning air. The enemy pilot broke off his attack run, climbing away from the defensive fire. But the other 2 fighters pressed their attacks. Cannon shells sparked off the bomber's wing surfaces. Warning lights flashed as systems took damage. Hydraulic pressure dropping, Sydney read from her instruments. Flight controls getting heavy. The B-52 was wounded but still flying. Sydney banked toward a narrow pass between 2 peaks, hoping to force the fighters into single file where her tail gun could engage them one at a time. The pass was barely wide enough for the bomber's wingspan. Sydney flew down the center, rocky walls flashing past on both sides. Behind her, the 2 pursuing fighters had no choice but to follow in single file. Her tail gun engaged the trailing aircraft. The enemy pilot tried to return fire, but his angle was wrong. Cannon shells chewed into the canyon wall beside Sydney's aircraft. The lead fighter pilot grew impatient. He closed the distance, trying to position for a killing shot. But the narrow pass left him nowhere to maneuver when Sydney suddenly chopped her throttles. The fighter overshot, finding itself directly in front of the bomber's nose. Sydney triggered her forward-firing guns, weapons normally used against ground targets. The enemy aircraft disintegrated in a ball of flame and debris. "One down," Sydney said grimly. The second fighter pulled up and climbed out of the canyon. Sydney emerged from the pass to find 3 enemy aircraft circling above her like vultures. The Phantom's dark gray fighter maintained its distance, still watching, still learning. Her fuel gauge showed less than half remaining. The damaged hydraulic system was leaking fluid, making the controls increasingly difficult to operate. And now her number 6 engine was showing oil pressure problems. Sydney turned south, toward friendly territory still 200 miles away. Maybe she could outrun them in a straight line. Maybe the fighters would run low on fuel first. But the Phantom had other ideas. His radio voice cut through the static, speaking perfect English with only a slight accent. "American bomber pilot, this is Colonel Alexei Volkov. You have flown well today." Sydney keyed her microphone. "Thanks for the compliment, Colonel. Mind calling off your attack dogs?" "I am afraid that is not possible. But I wanted you to know that I respect your skill. It has been many years since I encountered a worthy opponent. Glad I could make your day interesting." "Indeed. But now the game must end. You are wounded, low on fuel, and far from home. Surrender, and I will guarantee your safety." Sydney looked at her instrument panel. 3 engines showing problems, hydraulic pressure dropping, fuel running low. The Phantom was right about her situation. "That's a generous offer, Colonel. But I think I'll pass." "As I expected." "Then let us finish this properly." The 3 enemy fighters began their final approach. This time, there would be no mistakes, no opportunities for escape. They came from 3 directions simultaneously, cutting off all possible escape routes. Sydney dove toward a maze of narrow canyons, her last hope of avoiding the coordinated attack. But the bomber was sluggish now, responding slowly to control inputs. Damaged systems and failing engines were taking their toll. Cannon fire erupted from all directions. The B-52 shuddered as shells tore through its aluminum skin. Warning lights cascaded across the instrument panel. Smoke began filling the cockpit. "Number 4 engine fire." Sydney read from the warning panel. She pulled the fire handle, shutting down the burning turbine. Now she was flying on 7 engines instead of 8. The canyons offered temporary shelter, but Sydney knew she couldn't hide forever. The fighters would wear her down, one attack at a time, until the massive bomber could no longer maneuver. She needed to change the game somehow. Fighting was impossible. Bombers don't win dogfights against fighters. Running was becoming impossible as her aircraft accumulated damage. That left only one option. Something so unexpected that even the Phantom wouldn't anticipate it. Sydney pushed her remaining engines to maximum power one final time. The turbojet screamed in protest, but responded with thrust. She climbed out of the canyon system, heading directly toward the circling fighters. "What are you doing?" The Phantom's voice carried genuine curiosity. "Something crazy," Sydney replied. She rolled the B-52 inverted and dove straight down, using the bomber's tremendous weight to build speed. The fighters scattered again, unsure how to intercept an aircraft behaving like a guided missile. But Sydney wasn't planning to crash. At the last possible moment, she pulled out of the dive and leveled off barely 30 feet above the valley floor. Her airspeed indicator showed numbers the B-52 was never designed to reach. Behind her, the fighters regrouped for pursuit. But now Sydney was flying faster than they expected, using terrain features to mask her exact position. "Clever," the Phantom transmitted. "But you cannot maintain such speed for long. Your engines will fail." He was right. Sydney could already see temperature warnings on her remaining engines. She had maybe 5 minutes before catastrophic failures forced her to land or crash. 5 minutes to cover the remaining distance to friendly territory. 5 minutes to stay ahead of the most dangerous pilot in enemy service. 5 minutes to prove that sometimes the impossible was just barely possible. Sydney checked her navigation display one final time. The border lay 30 miles ahead, marked by a river valley that separated enemy territory from friendly airspace. 30 miles. At current speed, that meant 4 minutes of flight time. 4 minutes to survival, with the Phantom closing in behind her and her aircraft falling apart around her. The final chase had begun and Sydney Grant was running out of miracles. 4 minutes to the border. Sydney's remaining 7 engines screamed at maximum power, their temperature gauges climbing into the red zone. Behind her, the Phantom's dark gray fighter closed the distance with deadly patience. "Your engines are failing," his voice crackled through her headset. "Land now and I guarantee your safety." Sydney watched her number 2 engine's temperature spike beyond safe limits. She had no choice. She pulled the throttle back to prevent catastrophic failure. Now she was down to 6 engines. "Still flying, Colonel," she transmitted back. "Admirable determination. But mathematics are against you." The river valley marking the border appeared ahead, a silver line winding between mountain peaks. 20 miles to go. At her current speed, barely 3 minutes of flight time. But her engines wouldn't last 3 minutes. Another temperature warning. Sydney shut down number 7 engine before it could catch fire. 5 engines remaining. The Phantom's fighter was close enough now that she could see details through her mirrors. The aircraft looked pristine, unmarked by battle damage. Its pilot had conserved fuel and ammunition while his wingmen wore down the American bomber. "You fought well today," the Phantom transmitted. "Better than any pilot I have faced. But this ends now." His fighter pulled alongside the struggling bomber, matching its speed effortlessly. Through her side window, Sydney could see the enemy pilot clearly, a middle-aged man with silver hair, his face calm and professional behind his oxygen mask. He raised one gloved hand in a pilot's salute, acknowledging her skill before moving into position for the final attack. That gesture sparked something in Sydney's mind. The Phantom was treating this like a formal duel, following the unwritten rules of aerial combat. He would position himself properly, warn his opponent, then deliver the killing blow with honor intact. But Sydney wasn't bound by those same rules. Instead of maintaining steady flight, she suddenly chopped power on her left engines while advancing throttles on the right side. The massive bomber yawed violently to the left, its wings sweeping toward the Phantom's fighter like a giant fly swatter. The enemy pilot reacted instantly, diving to avoid collision. But in that split second of evasive maneuvering, his carefully planned attack dissolved into chaos. Sydney rolled the bomber inverted and dove after him, using gravity to maintain speed as her engines continued failing. The world turned upside down as she followed the Phantom through a series of valleys, both aircraft racing toward the border at maximum speed. Impossible. The Phantom's voice carried genuine surprise. Bombers do not chase fighters. This one does, Sydney replied, keeping the inverted B-52 in pursuit. Her unusual tactics were working. The Phantom expected conventional bomber behavior, straight flight, defensive maneuvers, predictable escape routes. He'd never faced a pilot willing to turn a heavy bomber into an aggressive interceptor. But Sydney's aircraft was dying around her. Number 3 engine seized with a grinding roar of tortured metal. Number 5 showed falling oil pressure. She was down to 4 engines now, and the bomber's flight characteristics were becoming increasingly unstable. The border was 10 miles ahead, less than 2 minutes at current speed. But the Phantom was pulling away, his superior aircraft outrunning the damaged bomber. Sydney made a desperate decision. She rolled level and activated the bomber's defensive electronic systems, not the jammers designed to confuse missiles, but the high-powered radar transmitters used for navigation and targeting. Every electronic system on the B-52 began broadcasting at maximum power. The result was electromagnetic chaos. Radio communications dissolved into static. Navigation systems failed. Even the Phantom's sophisticated fighter was affected, its digital displays flickering as powerful radar signals overwhelmed its electronics. "What are you doing?" The Phantom's voice was barely audible through the electronic interference. "Evening the odds," Sydney replied. With both aircraft essentially flying blind, the Phantom's technological advantages disappeared. Experience and instinct became more important than advanced radar and computer-controlled weapons. Sydney knew these mountains from months of study. She could navigate by terrain features alone. The Phantom was flying over unfamiliar territory with his electronics compromised. She turned toward a narrow canyon she'd memorized during mission planning. The passage was barely wide enough for the B-52, but it led directly to the border river. If she could thread the needle one more time. The canyon walls rose on both sides, their rocky faces seeming to brush the bomber's wingtips. Sydney flew by pure instinct now, feeling the aircraft's responses through her hands and feet. Behind her, she heard the Phantom's engine noise growing fainter. He'd been forced to reduce speed in the narrow canyon, unwilling to risk collision with the walls. The canyon opened suddenly into the border valley. Ahead lay the river, its waters marking the boundary between enemy territory and safety. Sydney was 500 yards from friendly airspace. But her last engines were failing. Number 1 showed 0 oil pressure. Number 8 was overheating catastrophically. The massive bomber was running on borrowed time and fading power. She crossed the river at barely 200 feet altitude, her remaining engines coughing and sputtering. Warning lights covered the instrument panel like Christmas decorations. Big Bird, this is border control. We have you on radar. Medical and crash crews standing by. Sydney keyed her microphone with shaking hands. Border control, Big Bird. Declaring emergency. Multiple engine failures, hydraulic problems, battle damage. Need immediate assistance. Roger, Big Bird. Clear to land any runway. We're ready for you. Behind her, the Phantom's fighter appeared at the canyon mouth. For a moment, Sydney thought he might pursue across the border. But the dark gray aircraft pulled into a climbing turn, heading back toward enemy territory. His radio transmission came through clearly in the sudden electronic silence. Well flown, American. Until we meet again. Sydney managed to smile despite everything. Looking forward to it, Colonel. Her number 1 engine seized completely, windmilling to a stop. Number 8 began trailing black smoke. She was down to 2 functioning engines on a bomber designed for 8. The emergency runway appeared ahead, its length marked by flashing lights. Fire trucks and ambulances lined both sides, ready for whatever remained of her aircraft. Sydney lowered the landing gear manually. The hydraulic system had finally failed completely. The massive wheels locked into position with a reassuring thunk. She configured the bomber for landing, extending flaps and adjusting what little remained of her power. The B-52 touched down hard, its damaged structure groaning under the stress. But the landing gear held, the brakes functioned, and the bomber rolled to a stop in a cloud of smoke and steam. Sydney shut down the remaining engines and sat in the sudden silence. Through her cracked windscreen, she could see ground crews running toward the aircraft. She'd made it home. She unstrapped from her seat and climbed down through the hatch. Her legs felt unsteady after hours of combat flying. Around her, maintenance crews swarmed over the battle-damaged bomber, counting bullet holes and assessing structural damage. Colonel Martinez appeared beside her, his face showing relief and pride in equal measure. "How's the aircraft?" Sydney asked. "Reparable. How's the pilot?" Sydney looked back at the B-52, its aluminum skin punctured by cannon shells, its engines silent and cooling in the morning air. The massive bomber had brought her home despite impossible odds. "The pilot's fine, sir. Mission accomplished." Martinez smiled and handed her a cup of coffee from a nearby truck. "The intelligence you gathered prevented a major conflict." The photos showed those weapons were defensive systems, not offensive preparations. Sydney sipped the coffee and watched mechanics examining her aircraft. In a few weeks, the B-52 would be repaired and ready for another mission. But today, both pilot and bomber had earned their rest. "Any word on the Phantom?" she asked. "Intelligence reports he returned safely to his base." Apparently, he told his superiors that American bomber pilots had become significantly more dangerous. Sydney smiled at that. Maybe next time he'll think twice before hunting a B-52. Maybe, but something tells me you two will meet again someday. Sydney nodded, finishing her coffee as the sun climbed higher over the mountains. Today she'd proven that skill and determination could overcome any odds. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, she was content to be alive, on the ground, and safely home. The mission was complete. Against all odds, Captain Sydney Grant had brought her bomber home. If Sydney's incredible story inspired you, hit that like button and subscribe for more amazing military tales. What did you think of her tactics against the Phantom? Share your thoughts in the comments below.